welcome to the Short Story Workshop. My name is Mel, I'm here with Matt and Simone. In each episode we read a short story and then discuss it. This week's story is The Celestial Omnibus by E.M. Forster. Matt, you picked this story, can you tell us why you chose it?
I first read this story quite a long time ago, probably about a year ago, and I liked it. It's kind of stuck in my head. It's got its own meaning. It's kind of a parable, I suppose. But I think there's probably maybe more to it than I originally thought. It's very referential to other literature and other authors and writers of the time. You know, it's just an interesting story.
Cool. Just quickly, what's a parable?
Simple story used to illustrate a moral or spiritual lesson, hence most of the stories in the Bible, for example, are considered parables.
Cool. Here is The Celestial Omnibus by E.M. Forster. The boy who resided at Agathox Lodge, 28 Buckingham Park Road, Surbiton, had often been puzzled by the old signpost that stood almost opposite. He asked his mother about it, and she replied that it was a joke, and not a very nice one, which had been made many years back by some naughty young men, and that the police ought to remove it, for there were two strange things about this signpost. Firstly, it pointed up a blank alley, and secondly, it had painted on it in faded characters the words, "To Heaven." "What kind of young men were they?" he asked. "I think your father told me that one of them wrote verses and was expelled from the university and came to grief in other ways. Still, it was a long time ago. You must ask your father about it. He will say the same as I do, that it was put up as a joke." "So it doesn't mean anything at all?" She sent him upstairs to put on his best things, for the Bonzes were coming to tea, and he was to hand the cake stand. It struck him, as he wrenched on his tightening trousers, that he might do worse than ask Mr. Bonds about the signpost. His father, though very kind, always laughed at him, shrieked with laughter whenever he or any other child asked a question or spoke. But Mr. Bonds was serious as well as kind. He had a beautiful house, and lent one books. He was a churchwarden, and a candidate for the county council. He had donated to the Free Library enormously. He presided over the Literary Society and had members of Parliament to stop with him. In short, he was probably the wisest person alive. Yet even Mr. Bonds could only say that the signpost was a joke, the joke of a person named Shelley. "Of course," cried the mother. "I told you so, dear. That was the name." "Had you never heard of Shelley?" asked Mr. Bonds. "No," said the boy, and hung his head. "But is there no Shelley in the house?" "Why, yes," exclaimed the lady in much agitation. "Dear Mr. Bonds, we aren't such Philistines as that. 2 at the least. One a wedding present, and the other smaller print in one of the spare rooms." "I believe we have 7 Shelleys," said Mr. Bonds, with a slow smile. Then he brushed the cake crumbs off his stomach and, together with his daughter, rose to go. The boy, obeying a wink from his mother, saw them all the way to the garden gate, and when they had gone he did not at once return to the house, but gazed for a little up and down Buckingham Park Road. His parents lived at the right end of it. After number 39, the quality of the houses dropped very suddenly, and 64 had not even a separate servants' entrance. But at the present moment the whole road looked rather pretty, for the sun had just set in splendour, and the inequalities of rent were drowned in a saffron afterglow. Small birds twittered, and the breadwinner's train shrieked musically down through the cutting, that wonderful cutting which has drawn to itself the whole beauty out of Surbiton, and clad itself, like any alpine valley, with the glory of the fir and the silver birch and the primrose. It was this cutting that had first stirred desires within the boy, desires for something just a little different, he knew not what, desires that would return whenever things were sunlit, as they were this evening, running up and down inside him, up and down, till he would feel quite unusual all over, and as likely as not would want to cry. This evening he was even sillier, for he slipped across the road towards the signpost and began to run up the blank alley. The alley runs between high walls, the walls of the gardens of Ivanhoe and Belle Vista respectively. It smells a little all the way, and is scarcely 20 yards long, including the turn at the end. So not unnaturally the boy soon came to a standstill. "I'd like to kick that Shelley," he exclaimed, and glanced idly at a piece of paper which was pasted on the wall. Rather an odd piece of paper, and he read it carefully before he turned back. This is what he read. S and C.R.C.C. Alteration in service. Owing to a lack of patronage, the company are regretfully compelled to suspend the hourly service and retain only the sunrise and sunset omnibuses, which will run as usual. It is to be hoped the public will patronise an arrangement which is intended for their convenience. As an extra inducement, the company will, for the first time, now issue return tickets, available one day only, which may be obtained of the driver. Passengers are again reminded that no tickets are issued at the other end, and that no complaints in this connection will receive consideration from the company. Nor will the company be responsible for any negligence or stupidity on the part of passengers, nor for hailstorms, lightning, loss of tickets, nor for any act of God. Now, he had never seen this notice before, nor could he imagine where the omnibus went to. S, of course, was for Surbiton, and RCC meant Road Car Company. But what was the meaning of the other C? Combe Maiden, perhaps, or possibly City. Yes, it could not hope to compete with the South Western. The whole thing, the boy reflected, was run on hopelessly unbusinesslike lines. Why no tickets from the other end? And what an hour to start! Then he realised that unless the notice was a hoax, an omnibus must have been starting just as he was wishing the Bonzes goodbye. He peered at the ground through the gathering dust, and there he saw what might or might not be the marks of wheels, yet nothing had come out of the alley, and he had never seen an omnibus at any time in the Buckingham Park Road. No, it must be a hoax, like the signposts, like the fairy tales, like the dreams upon which he would wake suddenly in the night, and with a sigh he stepped from the alley, right into the arms of his father. Oh, how his father laughed! "Poor, poor Bopsy," he cried. "Diddums, Diddums, Diddums think he'd walkie-palkie up to Evink." And his mother, also convulsed with laughter, appeared on the steps of Agathoc's lodge. "Don't, Bob," she gasped. "Don't be so naughty. Oh, you'll kill me. Oh, leave the boy alone." But all that evening the joke was kept up. The father implored to be taken too. Was it a very tiring walk? Need one wipe one's shoes on the doormat? And the boy went to bed feeling faint and sore and thankful for the only one thing, that he had not said a word about the omnibus. It was a hoax, yet through his dreams it grew more and more real, and the streets of Surbiton, through which he saw it driving, seemed instead to become hoaxes and shadows. And very early in the morning he woke with a cry, for he had had a glimpse of its destination. He struck a match, and its light fell not only on his watch, but also on his calendar, so that he knew it to be half an hour to sunrise. It was pitch dark, for the fog had come down from London in the night, and all Surbiton was wrapped in its embraces. Yet he sprang out and undressed himself, for he was determined to settle once for all which was real, the omnibus or the streets. "I shall be a fool one way or the other," he thought, "until I know." Soon he was shivering in the road under the gas lamp that guarded the entrance to the alley. To enter the alley itself required some courage. Not only was it horribly dark, but he now realised that it was an impossible terminus for an omnibus. If it had not been for a policeman, whom he heard approaching through the fog, he would never have made the attempt. The next moment he had made the attempt and failed. Nothing but a blank alley and a very silly boy gaping at its dirty floor. It was a hoax. "I'll tell Papa and Mamma," he decided. "I deserve it. I deserve that they should know. I am too silly to be alive." And he went back to the gate of Agathoc's lodge. There he remembered that his watch was fast. The sun was not risen. It would not rise for 2 minutes. Give the bus every chance, he thought cynically, and returned into the alley. But the omnibus was there. It had 2 horses whose sides were still smoking from their journey, and its 2 great lamps shone through the fog against the alley's walls, changing their cobwebs and moss into tissues of fairyland. The driver was huddled up in a cape. He faced the blank wall, and how he had managed to drive in so neatly and so silently was one of the many things that the boy never discovered, nor could he imagine however he would drive out. "Please," his voice quavered through the foul brown air, "please, is that an omnibus?" "Omnibus est," said the driver, without turning round. There was a moment's silence. The policeman passed, coughing, by the entrance of the alley. The boy crouched in the shadow, for he did not want to be found out. He was pretty sure, too, that it was a pirate. Nothing else, he reasoned, would go from such odd places and at such odd hours. "About when do you start?" He tried to sound nonchalant. "At sunrise." "How far do you go?" "The whole way." "And can I have a return ticket which will bring me all the way back?" "You can." "Do you know, I half think I'll come." The driver made no answer. The sun must have risen, for he unhitched the brake, and scarcely had the boy jumped in before the omnibus was off. How? Did it turn? There was no room. Did it go forward? There was a blank wall. Yet it was moving at a stately pace through the fog, which should turn from brown to yellow. The thought of warm bed and warmer breakfast made the boy feel faint. He wished he had not come. His parents would not have approved. He would have gone back to them if the weather had not made it impossible. The solitude was terrible. He was the only passenger, and the omnibus, though well built, was cold and somewhat musty. He drew his coat round him, and in so doing chanced to feel his pocket. It was empty. He had forgotten his purse. "Stop!" he shouted. "Stop!" And then, being of a polite disposition, he glanced up at the painted notice board so that he might call the driver by name. "Mr. Brown! Stop-o! Do please stop!" Mr. Brown did not stop, but he opened a little window and looked in at the boy. His face was a surprise, so kind it was, and modest. "Mr. Brown, I've left my purse behind. I've not got a penny. I can't pay for the ticket. Will you take my watch, please? I am in the most awful hole." "Tickets on this line," said the driver, "whether single or return, can be purchased by coinage from no Turin mint, and a chronometer, though it had solaced the visuals of Charlemagne, or measured the slumbers of Laura, can acquire by no mutation the double cake that charms the fangless Cerberus of heaven." So saying, he handed in the necessary ticket, and while the boy said, "Thank you," continued, "Titular pretensions, I know it well, are vanity, yet they merit no censure when uttered on a laughing lip, and in a homonymous world are in some sort useful, since they do serve to distinguish one Jack from his fellow. Remember me, therefore, as Sir Thomas Brown." "Are you a sir? Oh, sorry." He had heard of these gentlemen drivers. "It is good of you about the ticket, but if you go on at this rate, however does your bus pay?" "It does not pay. It was not intended to pay. Many are the faults of my equipage. It is compounded too curiously of foreign woods. Its cushions tickle erudition rather than promote repose, and my horses are nourished not on the evergreen pastures of the moment, but on the dried bents and clovers of Latinity. But that it pays! That error, at all events, was never intended and never attained." "Sorry again," said the boy rather hopelessly. Sir Thomas looked sad, fearing that, even for a moment, he had been the cause of sadness. He invited the boy to come and sit beside him on the box, and together they journeyed on through the fog, which was now changing from yellow to white. There were no houses by the road, so it must be either Putney Heath or Wimbledon Common. "Have you been a driver always?" "I was a physician once." "But why did you stop? Weren't you good?" "As a healer of bodies I had scant success, and several score of my patients preceded me. But as a healer of the spirit I have succeeded beyond my hopes and my deserts. For though my draughts were not better nor subtler than those of other men, yet, by reason of the cunning goblets wherein I offered them, the queasy soul was oft times tempted to sip and be refreshed." "Queasy soul," he murmured. "If the sun sets with trees in front of it, and you suddenly come strange all over, is that a queasy soul? Have you felt that?" "Why, yes." After a pause he told the boy a very little, about the journey's end, but they did not chatter much, for the boy, when he liked a person, would as soon sit silent in his company as speak, and this, he discovered, was also the mind of Sir Thomas Brown, and of many others with whom he was to be acquainted. He heard, however, about the young man Shelley, who was now quite a famous person, with a carriage of his own, and about some of the other drivers who were in the service of the company. Meanwhile, the light grew stronger, though the fog did not disperse. It was now more like mist than fog, and at times would travel quickly across them, as if it was part of a cloud. They had been ascending, too, in a most puzzling way. For over 2 hours the horses had been pulling against the collar, and even if it were Richmond Hill, they ought to have been at the top long ago. Perhaps it was Epsom, or even the North Downs, yet the air seemed keener than that which blows on either, and as to the name of their destination, Sir Thomas Brown was silent. Crash! "Thunder, by Jove!" said the boy, "and not so far off either. Listen to the echoes. It's more like mountains." He thought, not very vividly, of his father and mother. He saw them sitting down to sausages and listening to the storm. He saw his own empty place. Then there would be questions, alarms, theories, jokes, consolations. They would expect him back at lunch. To lunch he would not come, nor to tea, but he would be in for dinner, and so his day's truancy would be over. If he had had his purse, he would have bought them presents. not that he should have known what to get them. Crash! The peal and the lightning came together. The cloud quivered as if it were alive, and torn streamers of mist rushed past. "Are you afraid?" asked Sir Thomas Browne. "What is there to be afraid of? Is it much farther?" The horses of the omnibus stopped just as a ball of fire burst up and exploded with a ringing noise that was deafening but clear, like the noise of a blacksmith's forge. All the cloud was shattered. "Oh, listen, Sir Thomas Browne. No, I mean look, we shall get a view at last. No, I mean listen, that sounds like a rainbow." The noise had died into the faintest murmur, beneath which another murmur grew, spreading stealthily, steadily, in a curve that widened but did not vary, and in widening curves a rainbow was spreading, from the horses' feet into the dissolving mists. "But how beautiful! What colours! Where will it stop? It is more like the rainbows you can tread on, more like dreams." The colour and the sound grew together. The rainbow spanned an enormous gulf. Clouds rushed under it and were pierced by it, and still it grew, reaching forward, conquering the darkness until it touched something that seemed more solid than a cloud. The boy stood up. "What is out there?" he called. "What does it rest on, out at that other end?" In the morning sunshine, a precipice shone forth beyond the gulf. A precipice, or was it a castle? The horses moved. They set their feet upon the rainbow. "Oh, look!" the boy shouted. "Oh, listen! Those caves, or are they gateways? Oh, look between those cliffs at those ledges. I see people. I see trees." "Look also below," whispered Sir Thomas. "Neglect not the diviner Acheron." The boy looked below, past the flames of the rainbow that licked against their wheels. The gulf also had cleared, and in its depths there flowed an everlasting river. One sunbeam entered and struck a green pool, and as they passed over he saw 3 maidens rise to the surface of the pool, singing and playing with something that glistened like a ring. "You, down in the water," he called. They answered, "You, up on the bridge." There was a burst of music. "You, up on the bridge, good luck to you. Truth in the depth, truth on the height. You, down in the water, what are you doing?" Sir Thomas Browne replied, "They sport in the mancipary possession of their gold," and the omnibus arrived. The boy was in disgrace. He sat locked up in the nursery of Agathoc's lodge, learning poetry for a punishment. His father had said, "My boy, I can pardon anything but untruthfulness," and had caned him, saying at each stroke, "There is no omnibus, no driver, no bridge, no mountain. You are a truant, gutter snipe, a liar." His father could be very stern at times. His mother had begged him to say he was sorry, but he could not say that. It was the greatest day of his life, in spite of the caning, and the poetry at the end of it. He had returned punctually at sunset, driven not by Sir Thomas Browne, but by a maiden lady who was full of quiet fun. They had talked of omnibuses and also of barouche landaus. How far away her gentle voice seemed now, yet it was scarcely 3 hours since he had left her up the alley. His mother called through the door, "Dear, you are to come down and to bring your poetry with you." He came down and found that Mr. Bonds was in the smoking room with his father. It had been a dinner party. "Here is the great traveller," said his father grimly. "Here is the young gentleman who drives in an omnibus over rainbows while young ladies sing to him." Pleased with his wit, he laughed. "After all," said Mr. Bonds, smiling, "there is something a little like it in Wagner. It is odd how, in quite illiterate minds, you will find glimmers of artistic truth. The case interests me. Let me plead for the culprit. We have all romanced in our time, haven't we?" "Hear how kind Mr. Bonds is," said his mother, while his father said, "Very well, let him say his poem, and that will do. He is going away to my sister on Tuesday. She will cure him of this alley slopering." Laughter. "Say your poem." The boy began, "Standing aloof in giant ignorance." His father laughed again, roared, "One for you, my son! Standing aloof in giant ignorance! I never knew these poets taught sense. Just describes you. Here, Bonds, you go in for poetry. Put him through it, will you, while I fetch up the whiskey?" "Yes, give me the Keats," said Mr. Bonds. "Let him say his Keats to me." So for a few moments the wise man and the ignorant boy were left alone in the smoking room. "Standing aloof in giant ignorance, of thee I dream, and of the Cyclades, as one who sits ashore and longs perchance to visit." "Quite right. To visit what?" "To visit dolphins, coral, and deep seas," said the boy, and burst into tears. "Come, come, why do you cry?" Because all these words that only rhymed before, now that I've come back, they're me. Mr. Bonds laid the Keats down. The case was more interesting than he had expected. You, he exclaimed, this sonnet, you? Yes, and look further on. Aye, on the shores of darkness there is light, and precipices show untrodden green. It is so, sir. All these things are true. I never doubted it, said Mr. Bonds with closed eyes. You believe me? You believe in the omnibus, and the driver, and the storm, and that return ticket I got for nothing, and... Tut, no more of your yarns, my boy. I meant that I never doubted the essential truth of poetry. Some day, when you read more, you will understand what I mean. But, Mr. Bonds, it is so. There is light upon the shores of darkness. I have seen it coming. Light and wind. Nonsense, said Mr. Bonds. If I had stopped, they tempted me. They told me to give up my ticket, for you cannot come back if you lose your ticket. They called from the river for it, and indeed I was tempted, for I have never been so happy as among those precipices. But I thought of my mother and father, and that I must fetch them. Yet they will not come, though the road starts opposite our house. It has all happened as the people up there warned me, and Mr. Bonds has disbelieved me like everyone else. I've been caned. I shall never see that mountain again. What's that about me? Said Mr. Bonds, sitting up in his chair very suddenly. I told them about you, and how clever you were, and how many books you had, and they said, Mr. Bonds will certainly disbelieve you. Stuff and nonsense, my young friend. You grow impertinent. I will settle the matter. Not a word to your father. I will cure you. Tomorrow evening I will myself call here to take you for a walk, and at sunset we will go up this alley opposite and hunt for your omnibus, you silly little boy. His face grew serious, for the boy was not disconcerted, but leapt about the room, singing, Joy, joy, I told them you would believe me. We will drive together over the rainbow. I told them that you would come. After all, could there be anything in this story? Wagner, Keats, Shelley, Sir Thomas Browne? Certainly the case was interesting. And on the morrow evening, even though it was pouring with rain, Mr. Bonds did not omit to call at Agathoc's lodge. The boy was ready, bubbling with excitement, and skipping about in a way that rather vexed the president of the Literary Society. They took a turn down Buckingham Park Road, and then, having seen that no one was watching them, slipped up the alley. Naturally enough, for the sun was setting, they ran straight against the omnibus. Good heavens! Exclaimed Mr. Bonds. Good gracious heavens! It was not the omnibus in which the boy had driven first, nor yet that in which he had returned. There were 3 horses, black, grey and white, the grey being the finest. The driver, who turned round at the mention of goodness and of heaven, was a sallow man with terrifying jaws and sunken eyes. Mr. Bonds, on seeing him, gave a cry as if of recognition, and began to tremble violently. The boy jumped in. Is it possible? Cried Mr. Bonds. Is the impossible possible? Sir, come in, sir. It is such a fine omnibus. Oh, here is his name. Don, someone. Mr. Bonds sprang in too. A blast of wind immediately slammed the omnibus door, and the shock jerked down all the omnibus blinds, which were very weak on their springs. Dan, show me. Good gracious heavens, we're moving. Hooray, said the boy. Mr. Bonds became flustered. He had not intended to be kidnapped. He could not find the door handle, nor push up the blinds. The omnibus was quite dark, and by the time he had struck a match, night had come on outside also. They were moving rapidly. A strange, a memorable adventure, he said, surveying the interior of the omnibus, which was large, roomy, and constructed with extreme regularity, every part exactly answering to every other part. Over the door, the handle of which was outside, was written, Lasciate ogni bondanza voi ci entrait. At least that was what was written, but Mr. Bond said that it was lasciati something, and that bondanza was a mistake for speranza. His voice sounded as if he was in church. Meanwhile, the boy called to the cadaverous driver for 2 return tickets. They were handed in without a word. Mr. Bonds covered his face with his hand and again trembled. Do you know who that is? He whispered, when the little window had shut upon them. It is the impossible. Well, I don't like him as much as Sir Thomas Browne, though I shouldn't be surprised if he had even more in him. More in him? He stamped irritably. By accident you have made the greatest discovery of the century, and all you can say is that there is more in this man? Do you remember those vellum books in my library, stamped with red lilies? This. Sit still, I bring you stupendous news. This is the man who wrote them." The boy sat quite still. "I wonder if we shall see Mrs. Gamp," he asked after a civil pause. Mrs. Gamp and Mrs. Harris? I like Mrs. Harris. I came upon them quite suddenly. Mrs. Gamp's bandboxes have moved over the rainbow so badly, all the bottoms have fallen out, and 2 of the pippins off her bedstead tumbled into the stream." "Out there sits the man who wrote my vellum books," thundered Mr. Bonds, "and you talk to me of Dickens and of Mrs. Gamp." "I know Mrs. Gamp so well," he apologised. "I could not help being glad to see her. I recognised her voice. She was telling Mrs. Harris about Mrs. Prigg." "Did you spend the whole day in her elevating company?" "Oh no, I raced. I met a man who took me out beyond to a racecourse. You run, and there are dolphins out at sea." "Indeed. Do you remember the man's name?" "Achilles. Well, no, he was later. Tom Jones." Mr. Bonds sighed heavily. "Well, my lad, you have made a miserable mess of it. Think of a cultured person with your opportunities. A cultured person would have known all these characters, and known what to have said to each. He would not have wasted his time with a Mrs. Gamp or a Tom Jones. The creations of Homer, of Shakespeare, and of him who drives us now would alone have contented him. He would not have raced. He would have asked intelligent questions." "But Mr. Bonds," said the boy humbly, "you will be a cultured person. I told them so." True, and I beg you not to disgrace me when we arrive. No gossiping, no running. Keep close to my side, and never speak to these immortals unless they speak to you. Yes, and give me the return tickets. You will be losing them." The boy surrendered the tickets, but felt a little sore. After all, he had found the way to this place. It was hard first to be disbelieved and then to be lectured. Meanwhile, the rain had stopped, and moonlight crept into the omnibus through the cracks in the blinds. "But how is there to be a rainbow?" cried the boy. "You distract me," snapped Mr. Bonds. "I wish to meditate on beauty. I wish to goodness I was with a reverent and sympathetic person." The lad bit his lip. He made 100 good resolutions. He would imitate Mr. Bonds all the visit. He would not laugh, or run, or sing, or do any of the vulgar things that must have disgusted his new friends last time. He would be very careful to pronounce their names properly, and to remember who knew whom. Achilles did not know Tom Jones, at least so Mr. Bonds said. The Duchess of Malfi was older than Mrs. Gamp, at least so Mr. Bonds said. He would be self-conscious, reticent, and prim. He would never say he liked anyone. Yet when the wind flew up, at a chance touch of his head, all these good resolutions went to the winds, for the omnibus had reached the summit of a moonlit hill, and there was the chasm, and there across it stood the old precipices, dreaming with their feet in the everlasting river. He exclaimed, "The mountain! Listen to the new tune in the water! Look at the campfires in the ravines!" And Mr. Bonds, after a hasty glance, retorted, "Water? Campfires? Ridiculous rubbish! Hold your tongue, there is nothing at all." Yet under his eyes a rainbow formed, compounded not of sunlight and storm, but of moonlight and the spray of the river. The 3 horses put their feet upon it. He thought it the finest rainbow he had seen, but did not dare say so, since Mr. Bonds said that nothing was there. He leant out, the window had opened, and sang the tune that rose from the sleeping waters. "Prelude to Rheingold," said Mr. Bonds suddenly. "Who taught you these leitmotifs?" He too looked out of the window. Then he behaved very oddly. He gave a choking cry, and fell back onto the omnibus floor. He writhed and kicked. His face was green. "Does the bridge make you dizzy?" the boy asked. "Dizzy!" gasped Mr. Bonds. "I want to go back. Tell the driver." But the driver shook his head. "We are nearly there," said the boy. "They are asleep. Shall I call? They will be so pleased to see you, for I have prepared them." Mr. Bonds moaned. They moved over the lunar rainbow, which ever and ever broke away behind their wheels. How still the night was! Who would be sentry at the gate? "I am coming," he shouted again, forgetting the 100 resolutions. "I am returning. I, the boy." "The boy is returning," cried a voice to other voices, who repeated, "The boy is returning." "I am bringing Mr. Bonds with me." Silence. "I should have said, Mr. Bonds is bringing me with him." Profound silence. "Who stands sentry?" "Achilles." And on the rocky causeway, close to the springing of the rainbow bridge, he saw a young man who carried a wonderful shield. "Mr. Bonds, it is Achilles, armed." "I want to go back," said Mr. Bonds. The last fragment of the rainbow melted. The wheels sang upon the living rock. The door of the omnibus burst open. Out leapt the boy. He could not resist, and sprang to meet the warrior who, stooping suddenly, caught him on his shield. "Achilles!" he cried. "Let me get down, for I am ignorant and vulgar, and I must wait for that Mr. Bonds of whom I told you yesterday." But Achilles raised him aloft. He crouched on the wonderful shield, on heroes and burning cities, on vineyards graven in gold, on every dear passion, every joy, on the entire image of the mountain that he had discovered, encircled, like it, with an everlasting stream. "No, no," he protested, "I am not worthy. It is Mr. Bonds who must be up here." But Mr. Bonds was whimpering, and Achilles trumpeted and cried, "Stand upright upon my shield!" "Sir, I did not mean to stand. Something made me stand. Sir, why do you delay? Here is only the great Achilles, whom you knew." Mr. Bonds screamed, "I see no one. I see nothing. I want to go back." Then he cried to the driver, "Save me. Let me stop in your chariot. I have honoured you. I have quoted you. I have bound you in vellum. Take me back to my world." The driver replied, "I am the means and not the end. I am the food and not the life. Stand by yourself as that boy has stood. I cannot save you, for poetry is a spirit, and they that would worship it must worship in spirit and in truth." Mr. Bonds, he could not resist, crawled out of the beautiful omnibus. His face appeared, gaping horribly. His hands followed, one gripping the step, the other beating the air. Now his shoulders emerged, his chest, his stomach. With a shriek of, "I see London!" he fell against the hard moonlit rock, fell into it as if it were water, fell through it, vanished, and was seen by the boy no more. "Where have you fallen to, Mr. Bonds? Here is a procession arriving to honour you with music and torches. Here come the men and women whose names you know. The mountain is awake, the river is awake, over the racecourse the sea is awaking those dolphins, and is all for you. They want you." There was the touch of fresh leaves on his forehead. Someone had crowned him. From the Kingston Gazette, Surbiton Times, and Paynes Park Observer. The body of Mr. Septimus Bonds has been found in a shockingly mutilated condition in the vicinity of Bermondsey Gasworks. The deceased's pockets contained a sovereign purse, a silver cigar case, a Bijot pronouncing dictionary, and a couple of omnibus tickets. The unfortunate gentleman had apparently been hurled from a considerable height. Foul play is suspected, and a thorough investigation is pending by the authorities. I was having a very good time reading this story, but it took me a stupidly long time to realise that he was literally going to heaven. I know.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I know there is the sign at the beginning, but somehow I completely missed that and thought it was probably metaphorical. So I was like, I don't know where this is, but this is great.
In a more contemporary story, I feel like it would be metaphorical.
Maybe that's why. And also, I didn't recognise the name. Is it Thomas Brown? Maybe if you were a reader of the story at the time, you'd be like, I know that guy, he's dead. And have like more of an idea of what was going on, where I was just like, oh, a merry journey on a mysterious omnibus, this is good. Like, of course, when I thought about it, I was like, oh, right, they've only just started doing return tickets.
Which is such a strange thing. They used to just take people to heaven and then just leave them there just because they got on a bus. It's very strange.
Up to a certain point, you choose when you die, like, obviously, again, up to a certain point, heavily highlighted here. But, like, you know, like, there's people talk about how when people get really old, after a certain point, they just kind of stop fighting. I kind of figured it was maybe like that, and that you can get on a bus.
What did you make of the story, Simone, when you first read it?
I mean, I got the they're going to heaven part. I thought they handled it quite cleverly with the transition, because I think that would be a very difficult thing to write about in detail because of the amount of ideas people have around what exactly heaven would constitute, and that I think if you try and write about it too closely, the very idea will fall apart. So I thought it was a very cleverly put together story. I can see how it's a parable because it feels like it's kind of preachy. Yeah, I had a mostly good time with it.
I'm going to ask probably the big question next, which was, it's a parable, but what does it mean? What message did you take from this story? I could think of a few things it might be about, like imagination, appreciating creative works, or this artistic truth that Bonds mentions, or is it just an enthusiasm for life? I'm not really sure. Did either of you have any more clearer ideas?
I think it's kind of a rebellion against a lot of the things that Bonds talks about, especially since his name is just Snob backwards.
Yeah.
Like, it's pretty clear that he's the bad guy here. You know, he's talking about the value of creative work. you can only write things that are definitely true in like a almost in like a moral sense. Like you have to write things that improve the world around you and that fit into the right pattern of what literature is or isn't. And it's not really how the boy approaches it, because he just kind of rolls with stuff, right? He's like, oh, it's Achilles or whatever, let's just have fun. And I think that's the idea, is that instead of trying to put a big framework around things and try and explain stuff like we're currently doing, you should just enjoy it.
So are we bonds at the moment?
Yeah.
I see. Okay.
A little bit.
I mean, I'd say we're not complete bonds in that I think we approach with heart as well as mind. Like, it's not just about being able to spurn out what books you've read for, like, because it sounds impressive. It's about enjoying it and getting something out of it, rather than just, like, the technicalities.
Well, kind of, I guess, the ownership aspect where he's like, well, I've got 7 Shelleys. How come you don't even have a Shelley?
Like, it's all about status.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a status symbol. It's not about appreciating the art itself.
I thought there was definitely like a social currency thread somewhere here that E.M. Forster seemed to cross about, kind of saying don't use creative works for social currency. They're there to be enjoyed.
There's a bit later on where I think he kind of nails what his point is. The bit when he's talking about the Latin on the bus, and Mr. Bonds assumes that there must be a mistake with what is written and retranslates it as something else. I think he says that, is it?
It was the reference to Inferno, wasn't it?
Not the original. So the original text was Lasciate ogni baldanza voi che entrante. Forgive my absolutely butchered Latin. The boy points out that's what's written, and Mr. Bonds changes it to the Dante reference, which is fitting given Dante is the driver at the time, which makes it originally abandon all self-importance, ye who enter here, to Mr. Bonds' translation, which is abandon all a hope, ye who enter here, which is famously the line that welcomes people to hell in Dante's Inferno.
Oh, the driver was Dante.
I love that as a detail for him being the tour guide to their trip with the Celestial. Like, I think it did have some really clever details in this story.
You're right, Simone. That's a really interesting part to look at the moral of the story, if you want to call it that, because the original meaning is correct for what the story is trying to say, but Mr. Bonds just sees the literary reference and tries to correct it, even though that's not what is trying to be said.
Anything more to say about the message or meaning of the story?
I just think it's something that resonates a lot with me. There's so many different ways of reading so deep into literature that, you got to remember that really you got to enjoy it. Otherwise, you're kind of just driving yourself crazy for no reason. You know what I mean? You can't get so deep into the analysis that you lose all joy.
Yeah. Ultimately, humans make art because humans have always made art and will always feel compelled to make art and create and tell stories. And while we can interpret these stories and it's fascinating to do so, at the heart of it, there's just something a lot more basic, I think.
It reminds me of this brilliant description of 2 characters where one of them loved to appreciate the theatre by gushing enthusiastically about every detail, and the other enjoyed theatre by picking the play apart at the seams and complaining about it. Yeah, the second guy has a more unusual way, because even though he complained a lot about it, that's the way he enjoys art.
I don't know, I can kind of appreciate the latter. Like, I'll talk about what I enjoy in a play, but, like, certainly after I go to a film with a friend of mine, we totally just sit down and pick it apart just to see what we think did well, what didn't work. Like, it's a good way of examining stories. Like, doesn't necessarily affect if I enjoyed it or not, but it's fun to do. And, like, what would you do instead?
Yeah, critiquing can be fun for sure.
There's something else as well in this story. I was not at all surprised to learn that E.M. Forster was gay. I think if you read this story with a 21st century mindset, it's kind of clear, kind of the anti-traditionalist kind of take on it, how his parents are kind of just mean and want him to be traditionally normal, and he's kind of a rebellion against that. I think it's kind of clearly in the subtext if you look for it.
Yes, that's a good pick. His relationship with his dad seems quite troubled as well.
Dad was horrible.
He was.
Considering how many times the characters are described as being nice and kind by the boy.
Yeah.
They're awful.
He says at the beginning that his father is a kind man, but not as kind as Mr. Bonds. Something like that.
Yeah, it's a questionable line.
All right, should we move on to talk about the central protagonist then, the boy? I found it interesting that he was never named. He's just the boy all through the story. And I was wondering why you thought that was. I think I came around to the idea that I think it's supposed to be because the boy could be any boy or any child, and that I think that's why, but I wondered if you had any alternative ideas or different ideas.
It was kind of like a self-insert, and he's kind of going for that idea that this could be you or me or anyone.
I would agree, but I'd also say that it reflects some of the attitudes of the other people in the text towards him, and that he's just the boy to them. Like, you know, he's not worthy of a name, he's just a kid. They don't take him seriously.
No, that scene where he comes out of the alleyway and his father just laughs at him for some reason for ages. So I think one of the things the story does really well is, transitions. So in particular, I love the bit between part 2 and 3 where they're in the magical heaven world and then it cuts to the next scene and the boy is being punished for lying. Like, I like it because it's got contrast.
It was the right time as well to bring us back out of the story, because we've spent the last few paragraphs in this crazy other world, which is apparently heaven, and it's got all these vivid descriptions and everything, and it's really cool, but it's going nowhere in terms of plot. So it was like pretty much exactly the right moment to pull us back and say, actually, what, re-examine where we're going with this, and to also reground the story again.
I think it's quite an impressive skill to know when to stop writing a scene. I used to find this quite hard when I was starting. I'd just write a scene forever and ever and ever and be like, wait, I need to cut this somewhere.
You need to know exactly what you want to say in a scene to know when to cut it, which is a difficult skill. I also think it's quite good because it holds the tension of the story until later, because you can't know for completely sure what heaven was like and if he's telling the truth, because you don't get to see it. Like, you're relying on the fact that he said it happened, but as a viewer, you don't kind of get to witness it. And therefore, when Spons is going, you don't quite know what to expect. Like, something is happening, but we don't know what. I can remember when I was reading it the first time, I honestly thought they were going to end up in hell.
I guess that would make sense, given the Dante. Did you have any further thoughts on how to achieve good scene transitions, other than what we've already talked about, which is timing, contrast, knowing when to end a scene?
Knowing when to hide things. Like this scene break, like Simone was talking about, specifically hides exactly what happens in heaven for the boy, which I think was a good shout. And that's one of the things that scene breaks can do for you. You just say, okay, we're not going to go there. And then it leaves a blank space, which is a kind of tension just by itself, because as you read through the rest of the story, you're trying to fill in the blank.
Good time to stop can also be when you've got a question on the reader's mind. Like, you pose a question and then you cut away and provide the answer later as well. It would be a good practical time to stop if you're someone who struggles.
How many of the names' references did you recognise? Because I definitely must have missed so many, and the ones that I did see, I had to Google. I think probably the ones I recognised myself were Greek myth ones, like, oh yeah, the river name and Achilles. I know who they are. I had no idea, like, they talked about the lady driving him back with the barouche landau. I probably butchered however you say that, but it's a kind of carriage. I googled it, and one of the things that came up was that they played quite a big part in Emma by Jane Austen, so I was like, oh, maybe that was Jane Austen. I know who she is.
Yeah, seems like it. It's an obscure reference though, like, come on.
Yeah, I got Achilles and Dante, basically.
You got Dante though, I did not. I was Googling, like, poets named Dan, and it came up with Daniel Defoe, and I was like, I don't think it's this guy.
No, I only got it though because I went through a bizarre Dante's Inferno phase when I was a teenager. Read the whole thing.
I see. Okay, maybe I can be forgiven for missing that one. Readers, if you spot any references that we have missed or you think are interesting, please tell me. I'll be interested to know, because I'm sure there's so much in here that if I was alive when this story was written, would be really great and funny. Like the three ladies playing with a ring in heaven. I'm sure they must be some people, but I don't know who they are.
I think Bond's comments on that, it's from Wagner, isn't it? Like, I don't know what in Wagner, because I don't know Wagner, but from what his comment, unless he's wrong, I assume it's from...
I think he's a musician, but I don't really know. So, just a fun question then. If either of you were going to put a historical figure in your story, who would you pick?
What?
That is an interesting question.
Depends a lot on the story.
Like, if you're setting it in a historical time period, then maybe a famous figure of that time period.
I love the idea of, like, Shakespeare popping up for some reason. I don't even like Shakespeare plays, but he just seemed like a very interesting and fun kind of person.
No, I'd love to do something about All those people who just mysteriously vanished, like Edgar Allan Poe.
Agatha Christie.
That'll be good.
Stories write themselves.
I know. I always think Mary Shelley's pretty cool.
True. The Shelleys are just kind of an interesting people. They're very unique.
It's one way to describe sleeping on your parents' grave for the first time.
I always like that they seem like they should be inside the stories themselves.
Yeah, it seems, maybe it's obvious, but it seems like the writing is very much almost a literal reflection of the author sometimes.
Alright, my last question then. So, the end of the story gives us a newspaper article describing the fate of Mr. Bonds. Fell from a very large height, died. What did you think about using that method to end the story rather than, I guess, seeing it from the boy's perspective?
I really like that it just kind of cuts you out of the story. It's just like, hey, we're done now. And in doing so, it leaves a few things unanswered and it makes you think, and you're like, oh, hang on a minute. This guy had both the return tickets because he took them because he's mean, and then just fell out of heaven, and this poor boy's just stuck there now.
That was the first thing I thought. The second he took the tickets, I was like, oh god, what's going to happen? Like, because they'd signposted the ticket thing so much that I knew it was going to come back to bite.
I didn't see that far ahead, but I like what it adds to the story, and that he didn't just screw himself, he screwed over, the next generation, if you want to think of it that way.
On the other hand, he did get to stay in, heaven. The worst
True.
places to get stuck. Yeah, they give him a crown, I don't think he's too sad.
I mean, that's the other part, is that the only reason the boy didn't stay there was because he was like, oh, my parents will be sad.
Yeah.
But his parents don't really seem like they deserve to be happy, so...
Yeah, it's quite cute that he would have come back for his parents to bring them to heaven too. Shame they didn't believe him.
I like that it brings the story back to reality as well. It's quite like a fantastical idea that a newspaper is something so everyday that it kind of goes, oh yeah, something did actually happen. It wasn't just like all in the boy's head.
They didn't just vanish, never to be heard of again.
In that way, it's similar to the previous scene transition, right? Because it just cuts away to ground the story immediately.
In quite a harsh, violent way as well. Did anyone else get horror elements from the story at all? Like, the final lines were pretty chilling.
Kind of. There's also this weird sense that, you're on this omnibus and then it just takes you wherever it's going.
You're the only one there.
You're the only one there. The driver does not seem very concerned for your safety, even though there's like lightning and a good chance that you'll just get shot out of the sky. And, at this point you're just resigned to your fate.
That's the Bond's perspective. I was in Boy's perspective. I was having a great time.
Yeah, see, I was for most of the part. And then you got to the end and it's like he's so scared that, like, even though he's a complete snob, I did kind of feel sorry for him because, like, that would be horrible. And yes, he's falling on his own lack of imagination quite literally. But also, like, I don't know, can you help if you have an imagination or not? Like, God, imagine stepping out and seeing London below you and then just falling. And meanwhile, this child is like, where have you fallen to, Mr. Bonds? Here are all the people with your names. The mountain is awake. The river is awake. It's freaking horror movie child talk.
I guess I did wonder if he deserved his fate.
Like, I don't think he was a nice guy, but also, I do pity him.
I feel like he was based on somebody E.M. Forster knew and had a grudge against him. That's why he met such a drastic end.
I could believe. But then I suppose it is his own fault for calling out the omnibus.
I do like the idea of a mysterious bus that takes you to heaven or to another world. Kind of got me by the core idea from the beginning. I was just like, this is good. I like this.
Notice how the drivers are authors.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting.
I know, clearly good writing can take you to either heaven or hell.
Let's hope hearing a story takes our listeners to heaven.
I know, I'd rather send them to hell, torment them with emotion. So much more fun.
So E.M. Forster, very privileged guy. He got left a lot of money when his father died, so he just grew up with his mother, but they were well provided for. He's went to King's College in Cambridge quite famously and lived there as a fellow for a lot of his life. He was a gay man, so like Matt said, you can kind of see it in the story when you know that. He had a very interesting love life, and I want to link this very interesting article in the description which talks about it a bit more. The gist of it is, he had a 40-year relationship with a policeman named Buckingham, and Buckingham was married. At first this was a problem, obviously. You don't want to marry a guy and then suddenly he's like, oh, well, this is E.M. Forster and I love him. And we're going to go off into his flat together for weekends and not really tell you about what goes on there. Not really what you want when you marry a guy. But as time went on, their relationship got a lot better to the point where they loved each other too. So it was sort of a three-way relationship in the end. E.M. Forster was sick and he had a stroke. Buckingham's wife was the one who looked after him. A very unconventional relationship, but it seemed to work for them. He also had another couple of unsuccessful relationships, but he was very firmly interested in men, that's for sure. Probably one of his most famous works is Maurice, which he wrote in 1913. This was when being gay was illegal. You could be arrested for it, hurt for it, worse. And it wasn't published until 1971, which was 2 years after he died. And I'm so glad I did not live in 1913.
For so many reasons. I mean, World War as well, Maurice is a good time, by the way.
E.M. Forster was also part of the Bloomsbury set of writers, which included Virginia Woolf. And she wrote in her diary that he says the simple things that clever people don't say. I find him the best of critics for that reason. I found that quite an interesting observation.
I love that quote. It seems very true from reading the story. At first it sounds kind of like an insult, he says simple things, but I appreciate that. I think maybe that's what Virginia Woolf was trying to say, is that a lot of people get so wrapped up in trying to sound smart that they don't say the obvious things that need to be said.
Alright, so the last thing I've got about E.M. Forster is that he declined a knighthood in 1949, which I thought was quite interesting, because usually when someone's like, hey, want to be a knight? You're going to be like, yeah! Didn't say why, but I assumed it was probably for political reasons, because I think he was really, really heavily pro-democracy and didn't really like any of the sort of idea that the royal family would have any influence over things.
I see. That makes sense.
Thank you for listening. Please leave a comment on our website, www.shortstoryworkshop.com, to let us know what you thought. You can also find all our previous short stories and episodes. And if you're listening on Spotify, please consider giving us a rating. Thank you very much. We'll be back with another story next week. Goodbye.